What happens when a baby elephant survives a horrific crash, only to lose his sight, lose his mother, and lose the will to keep living? At a rescue ranch in the Arizona desert, no doctor, no caretaker, and no human voice could reach the darkness swallowing him from the inside. Then one morning, a mysterious Serval cat appeared and did what no human could. But that was only the beginning, because that small wild creature did more than pull a blind elephant back from despair. She opened the door to a bond so strange, so painful, and so beautiful that it would leave everyone watching in silence until the very end. The transport convoy moved through southern Arizona just after dawn, when the desert still looked gentle enough to fool anyone passing through it. The light lay thin across the red flats, and the road stretched ahead in a pale ribbon between cactus, scrub, and distant mesas. Inside the trailer, the baby elephant leaned close to his mother, listening to the slow, familiar thunder of her breathing. He had been restless for most of the night, unsettled by the long journey from Nevada and the strange scent of metal, diesel, and human hands. But whenever the trailer rattled too hard or the wind pushed against the sides, his mother would brush him with her trunk. That touch meant the same thing every time. Stay close. I'm here. Nothing in his small life had ever felt more certain than that. Up front, Owen Carter kept both hands on the wheel and his eyes on the weather line gathering over the horizon. He had spent years on Arizona highways before joining rescue transport, and he knew how quickly the desert could change its mind. Behind him, another truck followed with supplies, while Hannah Cole sat beside the radio, checking the route to Red Mesa Wildlife Recovery Ranch and glancing back every few minutes toward the trailer. At first, the storm did not look dangerous. It was only a brown haze rising low against the earth, the kind locals barely bothered to mention. Then the wind shifted hard. Dust lifted in sheets. The morning sun dimmed behind a moving wall of grit, and the world ahead lost its edges. Owen eased off the gas, shoulders tightening as the trailer began to shudder under the first hard crosswinds. Inside the trailer, the calf felt the change before he understood it. The floor trembled in a new way. The air turned hot and bitter, thick with the taste of sand and something sharp from the electrical panel near the rear latch. He pressed closer to his mother's front leg. She answered with a low rumble that passed through the floorboards and up into his chest, steady but deeper than before, as if she sensed danger rushing toward them. The gust that hit next came like a shove from the sky. The trailer lurched sideways. Chains snapped against steel. Hannah grabbed the dashboard, and Owen fought the wheel as the lead truck slid across loose gravel near a stretch of roadside fencing. For one suspended second, everything seemed to hang in place. Dust, metal, breath, prayer. Then the right tires dropped, and the whole rig tipped with a scream of tearing iron. The baby elephant was thrown hard against his mother as the world rolled and split apart around them. Glass burst somewhere above him. A white-hot flash tore through the dark, followed by the sting of flying grit and sparks. He cried out once, high and raw, but the sound was swallowed by crashing metal. Then his mother's body struck the floor and shifted over him, heavy, trembling, shielding him from the worst of it as the trailer slammed still. When the motion stopped, there was no silence at first. There was groaning steel, the hiss of something leaking, the frantic calls of humans outside, the dry rattle of dust pouring through broken seams. The calf tried to lift his head, but pain burned through his face and eyes like fire pressed under his skin. He blinked and saw nothing clearly. Only pale bursts, smeared light, and then a darkness that seemed to thicken each time he tried again. His mother was pinned awkwardly against the wreckage, one side of her body twisted
where the frame had caved inward. Still, she moved. Slowly, painfully, she dragged her trunk across his shoulders and touched the side of his face. It was not a gentle touch anymore. It was desperate, searching, a final check to make sure he was still there. The calf leaned into it at once, trembling from fear, dust, and the strange terror of losing the world in front of him.
Outside, Owen kicked free his door and ran back through the storm with Ben Miller close behind him from the second truck. The trailer lay half on its side against a mangled fence, one panel bent inward like crushed tin. Hannah was already shouting into the radio for medical backup when Owen reached the broken rear hatch and heard the calf crying from inside. His face changed. He knew before opening it that whatever waited there would stay with him. They cut through twisted latches and forced a gap wide enough to climb in. Dust swirled around their flashlights, turning the beams into dull cones. The first thing Owen saw was the mother elephant. The second was the small body pressed beneath the shelter of her neck, still standing because he had nowhere else to go. One eye on the calf's face was swollen nearly shut. The other stared into the light without focus, clouded already by blood, grit, and shock. "Easy, baby," Hannah whispered from outside the opening, though her voice shook as badly as her hands. The mother tried once more to lift her head. She could not. Her trunk slid down from the calf's cheek and fell still against the bent metal floor. The little elephant froze. He did not bolt. He did not thrash. He simply leaned toward her, waiting for the next touch, the next rumble, the next proof that she had not left him alone inside this broken, burning dark. By the time the rescue crews from Red Mesa arrived, the storm had begun to move east, leaving the desert washed in a grim red haze. Owen and Hannah managed to free the calf, but he would not step away from his mother until her body was carefully lifted clear. Even then, he kept reaching back with his trunk toward the place where she had fallen. His eyes remained open, searching into a darkness no one around him could yet fully understand. By the time the convoy reached Red Mesa Wildlife Recovery Ranch, the desert light had turned pale and tired, as if the whole morning had been rubbed raw. The baby elephant was led from the rescue trailer into a wide recovery pen layered with soft sand, shaded canvas, and fresh water he could not yet find. He stood where they left him and did not move again. The ranch had taken in injured cats, burned horses, broken-winged hawks, even a bear cub once. But the sight of the little elephant silenced everyone who passed the pen. He was too young to carry that kind of stillness. Dust clung to the folds behind his ears. The fine hair along his head lay flat with dried sweat. His trunk hung low, barely alive. Dr. Grace Bennett came in without hurry, the way she always did with frightened animals. Her voice stayed level, her hands careful, her eyes taking in everything at once. She checked his breathing first, then the swelling around his face, then the damage to his eyes. The calf did not resist her. That worried her more than panic would have. Pain was there. Fear was there. But will was not. One eye was nearly sealed by trauma. The other remained open, cloudy beneath a film of damage that did not clear when she cleaned it. Grace tested for light response more than once. Nothing. She spoke quietly to Owen and Hannah near the fence, but the words still seemed to fall hard in the dry air. The injuries were severe. Infection was likely. Vision, if any remained, would be almost nothing at all. Owen took the news like a man swallowing gravel. He nodded once and looked back at the calf, who still faced the same direction, toward a place where his mother was no longer standing. Hannah stepped into the pen with a bottle of formula warmed just enough to smell sweet and familiar. She guided it toward his trunk and waited. He turned his head away slowly, as if even that small kindness had become too far to reach. Later that afternoon,
May Whitaker arrived from the main office, boots dusted red, clipboard still tucked beneath one arm. She had built Red Mesa into a place that saved what other places gave up on, and she did not scare easily. But when she watched the calf ignore water, formula, and the sound of human voices, her expression tightened. This was no longer only an injury case. It was becoming something deeper and much harder. They named him Eli before sunset, though no one could say exactly why that name felt right. Maybe it was Hannah, who said he needed something soft to meet him in all that darkness. Maybe it was Grace, who believed names helped people speak hope out loud. Owen wrote it on the intake board outside the pen, in thick black marker. Eli, male calf. Severe ocular trauma. Survived transport crash. As the hours passed, the ranch settled into its evening rhythm. Feed buckets scraped, hoses hissed, distant animals called from their enclosures, and the desert wind moved dry grass against the far fence. Eli answered none of it. He did not explore the edges of the pen. He did not search for water. He did not even sway the way anxious elephants sometimes did. He simply stood inside himself, unreachable. Grace tried again before dark, this time using a damp cloth to cool the skin around his eyes and a shallow pan of water set directly against his front feet. Most calves would investigate anything new with their trunks. Eli gave no sign that he noticed. When the water touched the edge of one toenail, he neither flinched nor stepped. Grace looked up then, and for the first time that day, there was helplessness in her face. That night, a call came in from one of the ranch donors asking whether the elephant would survive. May gave the practical answer because someone had to. He was stable for now. They were monitoring hydration. They were doing everything possible. But after she hung up, she stood alone outside Eli's pen longer than anyone expected. Under the yard light, the little elephant looked less like a patient than a shadow someone had forgotten to bury. Near midnight, Hannah returned with a blanket around her shoulders and a folding stool under one arm. She set the stool just outside the rails and sat facing him in the quiet. She did not bring another bottle. She did not try to coax him. Instead, she spoke into the dark as if speaking to a child, half asleep in the next room. She told him about the ranch at dawn, about wind through mesquite, about rain when it did come. Her voice moved softly through the pen. She described the tin roofs clicking in summer heat, the smell of alfalfa in the feed barn, the low hum of power lines out by the service road. She told him about a one-eyed mule named Jasper who kicked every gate except the one leading to pasture. She told him foolish little things because grief sometimes listened better when it wasn't cornered. Eli did not raise his head. Still, she stayed. The ranch lights dimmed one by one, and the desert opened wide around them, quiet except for insects and the occasional cry of a nightbird somewhere beyond the paddocks. Eli remained where he was, a small, unmoving shape in the sand. But Hannah could not bring herself to leave. Something about his silence felt less like refusal and more like a door closed from the inside by sorrow too heavy to lift. Just before dawn, Owen came back from checking the perimeter fences and found her there, eyes red, voice nearly gone, still talking to the calf as though he might someday remember the sound of being invited back. Eli had not eaten. He had not drunk. He had not reached for a single living thing since the crash. But in the thin blue hour before sunrise, no one at Red Mesa was willing to stop trying. Morning came thin and colorless over Red Mesa, the kind of desert dawn that looked almost fragile before the heat took hold. A pale wash of light settled across the barns, the fencing, and the hard-packed paths between pens. Inside the recovery yard, Eli stood exactly where he had stood the night before, his head lowered, his body quiet in a way that no animal his age should ever be. The storm that had followed the crash had passed east in the dark, but it had left its fingerprints everywhere. Dust clung to the rails. Feed tarps flapped loose at the corners. A short power failure before dawn had knocked out one of the yard lights, and now the place felt oddly hollow, as if the ranch had exhaled and never fully breathed back in. Eli seemed to belong to that stillness more than anything else there. Hannah came with a fresh bottle, warmed the same way she had warmed the others, and paused outside the pen before stepping closer. She always gave him a second now, as though some part of her still believed he might turn toward her if she was patient enough. He did not. The bottle touched the side of his trunk. He let it rest there, without reaching, without anger, without interest, as if it belonged to someone else's life. Not far away, Ben Miller was walking the line of maintenance sheds with a toolbox in one hand and a coil of wire over his shoulder. He had been checking loose panels since first light, muttering to himself about roof screws, bent
hinges, and wind that never knew when to quit. When he came around the backside of Eli's barn, he stopped so abruptly the wire slipped from his arm and hit the dirt with a soft metallic thud. A slender shape stood on the low roof above the recovery pen, still as carved stone against the brightening sky. At first, Ben thought it was a coyote in an odd place. Then it turned its head. Long legs, spotted coat, tall ears black on the back, gold at the edges. A serval. He knew that cat. Everyone on the ranch did. Sadie, the escape artist who had slipped her enclosure months ago and never truly come back. She had been seen at the far edge of the property sometimes, moving through scrub grass near the wash. Too quick for anyone to approach, she stole nothing, bothered no animals, and vanished whenever humans drew close. But this morning, she was not hunting field mice or watching birds. She was standing above Eli's pen, looking down into the dim space below with a concentration that made Ben forget to blink. He lifted a hand to wave Hannah over, then stopped himself. Something in the cat's posture warned against breaking the moment open too fast. Hannah saw his face from across the yard and followed his gaze upward. She froze with the bottle still in her hand. Sadie did not even glance at her. Every line of that small wild body seemed tuned toward the baby elephant standing in the half shadow beneath the roof line. For several seconds, nothing happened. Wind whispered through the chain-link windbreak near the service road. Somewhere, a mule kicked a stall door. Eli remained motionless below, his trunk hanging low, the bandage at one eye freshly changed. Then Sadie moved. Not much, just one careful step across the metal roof, then another. Her paws made a soft ticking sound against the sheet steel overhead. Eli's right ear twitched. It was such a small movement that Ben thought he might have imagined it. But Hannah saw it too. Her breath caught so sharply it almost became a sound. Sadie paused, head tilted, as if she had noticed the change below. Then she took 3 more measured steps along the roof seam. Tick, tick, tick. A low rasp followed from deep in her throat, not loud enough to be called a cry, only a rough little note of presence. Below her, Eli slowly lifted his head. The movement was clumsy at first, uncertain, as though he had nearly forgotten why living creatures answered the world at all. One ear angled upward, then the other. His trunk rose a few inches from the sand and hovered there, trembling almost imperceptibly. Hannah did not move. Ben did not move. Even the ranch seemed to pull tight around the silence, afraid a single careless sound might send whatever this was slipping away. Sadie crossed to the far edge of the roof and let one paw tap against a loose strip of flashing. The metal clicked brighter this time. Eli turned toward it. Not fully, not with confidence, but unmistakably.
His head shifted to follow the direction of that tiny sound. For the first time since the crash, he was not facing the absence of his mother. He was turning toward something living. Hannah felt tears sting before she understood why. It was not a miracle. Not yet. Not anything big enough to change the ranch by noon. It was smaller and somehow harder to bear. A blind, grieving calf who had refused water, milk, and every human voice had answered the footsteps of a creature that owed him nothing. She pressed her free hand to her mouth and whispered, "Oh, sweetheart," though she was no longer sure which one she meant. Sadie stayed a little longer, pacing the roofline in short, quiet passes. Each time the metal ticked beneath her paws, Eli listened. His body did not soften all at once. Grief did not step aside because of a few sounds in the morning. But something in him had shifted, like a door unlatched somewhere deep inside a dark house. When the serval finally leapt down beyond the far side of the barn and disappeared, Eli kept his head raised long after she was gone. The next morning, Eli was no longer standing in the exact same place when Hannah arrived. It was only a small difference, hardly more than the width of a hoof, but she saw it at once. His head was angled toward the roofline where the serval had walked the day before, and one ear remained half lifted, as if some part of him had stayed awake through the night, waiting for that sound to return. Red Mesa moved carefully around him after that. No one said much.
In the yard, Ben tightened loose metal panels without hammering. Owen rerouted a supply cart so its wheels would not rattle past the pen. Even May, who usually carried the day like a woman racing a clock no one else could hear, lowered her voice when she crossed the recovery lane. It felt foolish, maybe, but none of them wanted to break whatever had begun. Sadie came later than before, slipping out of the pale grass beyond the service shed just as the sun cleared the far fence. This time, she did not climb straight to the roof. She moved along the outer rail first, silent and deliberate, then sprang onto a low feed bin beside Eli's pen. Her tail flicked once. Her ears tipped forward. She made that same rough, careful sound, barely louder than breath through dry leaves. Eli answered by lifting his trunk. It did not reach far, only a slow, uncertain rise into empty air. But it was enough to send Hannah's heart against her ribs. She stayed where she was, beside the gate, bottle in hand, not daring to step closer. Sadie shifted her paws on the lid of the feed bin. The metal gave a soft, hollow knock. Eli turned toward it, then took a single awkward step, his foot dragging a little in the sand before finding balance. That one step changed the whole shape of the morning. Sadie jumped down and landed near the outside wall of the pen, where a narrow strip of weathered wood ran along the base of the fencing. She walked it slowly, letting her paws tap out a faint rhythm. Eli followed from inside, not neatly, not with trust yet, but with the stunned concentration of someone learning that the world still had edges, even if he could no longer see them. By the third day, the pattern had grown clearer. Sadie never rushed him. She made sound, then waited. She moved, then stopped. When Eli hesitated, she gave him another marker, a scrape of claws on wood, a low churr, a light thump on metal. Dr. Grace stood outside the pen that afternoon and watched in silence before murmuring to Owen that the serval was doing something none of them had been trained to teach. It was not affection in the way people like to name things. Sadie did not rub against him or seek touch for herself. What she offered was stranger than comfort and somehow more useful. She was giving him a map. A sound here meant boundary. A sound there meant distance. The pause between two small noises meant open space. For a blind calf drowning in confusion, it was the first language that made sense. Grace adjusted the recovery routine around those visits.
Water was moved to a shallower basin with a tin edge that carried vibration better. Ben bolted a loose strip of metal to one fence post because Sadie kept using that corner as a marker. Hannah began offering the bottle only when the serval was nearby. The first time Eli sniffed the nipple instead of turning away, Hannah had to bite the inside of her cheek to keep from crying too soon. He did not drink much, only a hesitant pull, then another, as if he distrusted even hunger now. But it was something. Grace wrote it down with steady hands and a face she forced to remain clinical. May called the board that evening and did not mention euthanasia for the first time in days. Still, no one let hope turn loud. Eli was fragile in every way that mattered. Recovery, if it came, would come quietly. A few mornings later, they opened the inner gate to the small sensory yard beside his pen. It was not much of a pasture, only a contained stretch of sand, worn grass, a trough, and a few safe objects placed for touch and sound. Owen stayed at Eli's shoulder, ready to stop him if panic took over. The calf stood trembling at the threshold, trunk lifted, the open air ahead of him too wide to understand. Sadie appeared on the far rail just then, as though she had been waiting for that exact moment. She crossed to a dented sheet of tin Ben had fastened there the day before and tapped it twice with one front paw. Eli's ears snapped toward her. He took one step out of the gate, then another. The sand changed under his feet. A breeze moved along his face. His trunk swayed low, searching for truth in the ground. Then everything tightened at once. Near a warm, flat rock by the fence, a rattlesnake lay coiled in the shade, almost invisible against the dust. Ben saw it and sucked in a breath too fast. Owen's hand lifted, but Sadie was faster. She sprang sideways onto the tin panel and raked it hard with both front paws. A sharp, violent burst of sound that split through the yard like a warning bell. Eli froze with one foot hanging halfway over the sand. The snake's rattle rose dry and furious from the ground ahead. Owen lunged forward and pulled the calf back by the shoulder as Ben grabbed a long pole and drove the snake away toward the outer scrub. For several seconds after, Eli stood shaking, ears spread wide, trunk high, his whole body tuned to danger he could not see. Sadie stayed on the rail until his breathing eased. That evening, the light softened over Red Mesa, turning the fences amber and the dust almost gold. Eli drank a little more water than he had the day before. He accepted another pull from the bottle while Sadie sat beyond the rails, watching in stillness. No one called it a miracle. It was too early, too delicate for that word. But in the gathering dusk, Hannah looked at the blind calf and understood something had truly begun. By the end of the week, the mornings at Red Mesa had begun to form a fragile kind of rhythm. Eli no longer waited in the dead stillness that had first frightened everyone. He listened now. Before the sun cleared the fencing, his ears would angle toward the outer yard, and his trunk would lift slightly, as if he were searching the air for one sound among thousands. Sadie never came at exactly the same time, but she always came with the same strange patience. Sometimes she crossed the roof line first. Sometimes she moved along the fence posts or the feed bins, placing her paws where wood, tin, or wire would answer back. Eli had started to follow those answers with growing certainty. The darkness around him was still vast, but it was no longer empty. Hannah noticed the change in smaller ways before anyone else did. Eli had begun to shift his weight when he heard her footsteps, no longer mistaking every human sound for noise that had nothing to do with him. He found the shallow water pan more often without help. Once, just once, he even reached for the bottle before it touched his trunk. That tiny movement left Hannah standing very still for a long time. Grace tried not to let hope outrun reason.
She kept charting his fluids, his swelling, his balance, his sleep. The damage to his eyes had not changed. If anything, the whiteness behind them looked more final each day. But the rest of him was changing. He was beginning to build a life around what remained instead of collapsing around what had been taken. In animals, Grace knew, that shift meant everything. It was Ben who first noticed the way Sadie landed. She came down from the roof one morning in a clean, narrow leap, but when she hit the ground beside the outer fence, there was the briefest hitch in her back leg. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would slow a wild thing for long. Still, Ben had spent too many years fixing gates, mending stalls, and watching injured animals hide their pain. By noon, he could not stop thinking about it. The next day, he saw it again. Sadie moved ahead of Eli along the boards, then paused near the corner post where the old tin marker hung. As she turned, sunlight slid across her hind leg and caught a pale seam buried beneath her spotted fur. Ben stepped closer without meaning to. There was another mark too, faint but unmistakable, a worn band of scar tissue circling low around her neck like the memory of something once tightened there. He found Grace in the medroom and told her what he had seen. She did not answer right away. Instead, she stood very still with both hands braced on the steel counter, remembering the file from months earlier. The Serval had come in from a private seizure outside Tucson, one of 3 exotic cats kept in wire pens behind a rental property, underfed, overstimulated, and handled like possessions instead of lives. "She was the worst of them," Grace said quietly at last. "Wouldn't let anyone near her. Threw herself against the enclosure until her neck bled. Damaged that hind leg trying to twist out of a restraint line." Ben looked back through the window toward Eli's yard, where Sadie was already moving again, tapping out soft directions through the warm morning. "So she knows," he murmured. Grace gave a single grave nod. That knowledge changed the feel of the ranch more than anyone expected. Sadie was no longer just a beautiful mystery appearing at the edge of the yard. She was something harder, sadder, and more recognizable. A creature that had once lived inside panic. A creature that knew what it meant to wake trapped, to hurt, to lash out, and to learn the shape of fear from the inside. Somehow, she had recognized that same prison in Eli. As if the timing had been chosen by some cruel instinct, May received a visit that same afternoon from a board representative named Russell Dean, a stiff man in a pressed shirt who spoke about liability as if it were holier than mercy. He watched Sadie from the far path with a frown already set in place and asked why an uncontained wild cat was being allowed near a high-value rehabilitation case. May answered carefully. Hannah did not. Russell called it dependence. Grace called it progress. Owen, standing with his arms folded outside the yard, said nothing until the man suggested trapping Sadie before. The situation became unsustainable. Then he looked over at Eli. The calf had been listening the whole time, his body angled toward the fence where Sadie had disappeared minutes earlier. "You take that cat away right now," Owen said, "and you won't just change his routine. You might break him." No final decision was made that day, but the threat lingered in the air long after Russell's truck rolled back down the road. Hannah felt it most that evening when she entered Eli's pen with the bottle. He drank better now when Sadie was nearby, but she had not returned since noon. Eli sniffed once, hesitated, and stood still. The old fear flashed through Hannah so sharply it made her hands cold. Then, after a long pause, he took 2 small pulls anyway. It was not much, not enough to erase the danger. But it was different from before. Eli was not drinking because the world felt safe again. He was drinking because some part of him
had begun to believe survival might still be worth the effort, even in moments when the sound he trusted most was absent. Hannah rested a hand lightly against the fence and let herself breathe for the first time all day. At sunset, Sadie appeared on the far end of the outer rail without warning, lit copper gold by the last slant of desert light. She did not come close. She only sat there, quiet and alert, while Eli lifted his head toward her and held it there. No rushing, no dramatic reunion, just the stillness of two wounded creatures who had somehow learned to recognize one another across fear. And in that soft, narrowing light, the ranch understood they were already changing each other. Rain came to Red Mesa in the middle of the night, sudden and hard, drumming against tin roofs and running in silver sheets through the flood channels west of the barns. By dawn, the storm had already passed, leaving the ranch rinsed clean in places and torn open in others. Puddles stood in the low ground. Mud clung to boots. The whole desert smelled dark, raw, and newly broken. Eli felt the change before anyone spoke it aloud. The air was cooler. The sand in his pen held moisture instead of heat. Water ticked from a loose gutter somewhere above him, and far beyond the recovery yard, the runoff still moved through the wash with a slow dragging sound. He lifted his trunk and listened into that altered world, waiting for the footfalls that had started to shape his mornings. Hannah came early with the bottle, her jeans wet to the knees from checking the outer path. She paused at the gate, expecting to hear the light tap of paws on wood or the faint scrape of claws along tin. Nothing answered her but dripping metal and the restless noise of birds shaken from their shelter. Eli turned toward the fence line anyway, ears raised, his whole body quietly expectant. She waited longer than usual before stepping inside. "Maybe she's late," she said softly, though she was mostly saying it for herself. Eli held still, listening. When Hannah touched the bottle to his trunk, he did not refuse it, but neither did he drink. Somewhere in the distance, a gate banged once in the wind. His head turned sharply toward the sound, then stilled again when it proved to be only that. Sadie did not appear that morning. At first, the absence felt small enough to explain away. A wild thing might choose another trail after rain. A flooded wash might delay her. Even Ben, who noticed everything once he decided to, shrugged and said the storm probably pushed her farther east for the night. But Eli did not take the morning as ordinary. He walked to the corner where Sadie often paused near the tin marker and stood there for a long time, listening into emptiness. Then, for the first time, since the crash, he began to search. It was not the aimless panic of a frightened calf. It was slower than that, sadder, almost thoughtful. He crossed the sensory yard in a loose curve, stopped near the feed bin where Sadie had first knocked out a rhythm for him, then moved toward the roofline of the recovery barn. His trunk lifted, testing the air. His ears turned and turned again. Each pause felt like a question the world refused to answer. By noon, the ranch had started counting the damage from the storm. Ben and Owen found one section of outer fencing bent by runoff and an old drainage culvert half choked with brush and red mud. May fielded calls about supplies delayed on the county road. Grace checked Eli's eyes and hydration, then watched him from outside the pen with a tightness in her mouth she did not try to hide. He was unsettled in a way numbers could not measure. That afternoon, he gave voice to it. The sound rose from deep in his chest, low and resonant, not loud enough to startle the horses in the next yard, but heavy enough to travel through the rails beneath Hannah's hand. It was not fear. It was not pain. It was longing shaped into sound. He let it go once, then again, listening after each call, as if he believed something out there might answer back from behind the wet wind and broken ground. Hannah felt her eyes sting. The old Eli would have folded inward by now. He would have chosen stillness over uncertainty, silence over waiting. But this was different, and somehow that made it ache more. He missed her. That simple truth moved through the ranch like a current. Not because Sadie had become a habit, but because she had become part of the way he understood life returning to him. Her absence left an outline. The second morning came bright and windless, and still Sadie did not return. Eli stood at the gate to the sensory yard before Hannah even reached it, as if he had memorized the place where hope usually entered. He listened so intently that every other sound around him seemed to thin out in comparison. When nothing came, he turned away, then back again, caught between patience and the first edges of grief. Owen found him that way just after sunrise, and for a long moment he said nothing. He had seen men on highways wait for help that wasn't coming, engines dying beside them in the dark. Eli's stillness held some of that same terrible dignity. Not collapse, not surrender, just the painful effort of remaining open to a world that had once already taken too much. Owen rested his forearms on the fence and kept him company in silence. By the third day, everyone at Red Mesa understood that something had changed. Sadie was not simply wandering elsewhere. The pattern of her absence had grown too sharp, too wrong. Even May, practical as ever, stopped speaking of the Serval as a risk and began asking Ben for reports on the Western Wash and the broken culvert. Grace said little, but when she watched Eli tracing the same searching arc through the yard, her expression had gone grave. Still, he did not fall apart. He drank some. He found the water pan on his own. He moved more slowly than before, but he moved. That was the part Hannah could not stop thinking about as dusk settled over the ranch in a wash of rose and violet light. Sadie had not only drawn him back from the edge, she had left something inside him. Some map, some courage, some way of staying in the world, even when the guide itself was gone. That evening, Eli stood facing the western side of the property long after the other animals had quieted. The air carried the damp scent of creosote, mud, and crushed grass from the storm. Once, he lifted his trunk high and held it there, perfectly still, as if listening with his whole body to something too faint for human ears. Then he lowered it again, not defeated, not calm, but waiting in a way that made Hannah's chest tighten. Out beyond the ranch lights, the desert darkened around the flood channels and broken brush. Somewhere past the western fence, water still moved through stone and concrete, dragging bits of branch and wire through the night. Inside the recovery yard, the blind calf remained awake a little longer than usual, turned toward that unseen distance. And though no one at Red Mesa could have explained why, the silence no longer felt empty. It felt like a warning. The fourth morning without Sadie began under a sky the color of old tin. The storm had left the western side of Red Mesa, scarred and uneven, with fresh gullies carved through the dirt and mud packed deep around the culvert road. Eli stood near the gate before anyone called him there. His head lifted, his ears held wide, listening to something that lay beyond the reach of ordinary sound. Hannah opened the latch and expected the same slow searching pattern he had followed for days. Instead, Eli stepped past the usual turn in the path and kept going. He did not angle toward the water pan or the sensory yard fence, where Sadie had once tapped out her careful map. His pace was measured, but there was purpose in it now, a quiet certainty that made Hannah's chest tighten before she understood why. "Eli," she called softly, hurrying after him with the bottle still in one hand. He gave no sign that he heard her. Owen looked up from the service shed and saw the calf moving toward the western edge of the ranch, beyond the safe arc of the training ground. One glance at Hannah's face was enough. He dropped his tools, shouted for Ben, and started after them through the damp, rutted path. Eli moved differently that morning. He was not wandering through absence anymore. His trunk lifted high, drawing in scent, then lowered to brush the ground before rising again. Each pause seemed to gather information from the air, the soil, the faint tremors beneath his feet. Once he turned slightly, then corrected himself, as if some invisible thread had pulled taut again somewhere ahead of him in the wet desert silence. Ben caught up at the edge of the outer wash, boots sinking in red mud. "He's tracking something," he said under his breath. And for once, no one argued. Even May, who had followed at a distance after hearing Owen call out, stopped speaking the moment she saw Eli's face. Blind as he was, he wore the unmistakable look of an animal following a truth no one else around him could yet perceive. The western fence had been bent open by runoff, leaving a gap wide enough for coyote, deer, or anything smaller and wilder. Eli passed through it without hesitation. Beyond lay a stretch of low scrub, fallen branches, and the half-collapsed drainage line Ben had marked the day before. Water still whispered through the buried concrete pipe, dragging grit and broken leaves with it. The place smelled of rust, mud, and storm-torn earth. Then Eli stopped. His whole body stilled so completely that even the wind seemed to pause around him. His trunk extended toward a tangle of brush and rebar near the mouth of the culvert, trembling at the tip. A low sound rolled out of him, deep and urgent, the same chest-heavy call he had used in the days Sadie vanished. But this time, it was sharper, directed. Not grief now. Recognition. Owen was the first to move. He pushed through the brush, crouched low, and shone his flashlight beneath the broken lip of concrete. For a second, he saw nothing but pooled water and debris. Then two amber eyes opened weakly in the dark. Sadie lay wedged beneath a sagging panel of wire mesh washed down by the flood, one hind leg pinned between twisted steel and a buried timber. She was alive, but only barely. Hannah made a sound like something breaking in her throat. Sadie tried to lift her head and failed, then turned it just enough toward the mouth of the culvert when Eli rumbled again. The Serval's ears twitched at the sound. Mud streaked her coat. One side of her neck was slick with rain-dried dirt, and the trapped leg had swollen tight above the paw. She had been there for days, hidden by storm wreckage and silence. Everything after that happened fast, but not carelessly. Ben ran for the hydraulic cutters. Grace came with a med kit and sedatives she prayed she would not need. Owen dropped to one knee in the mud and began sawing through the smaller lengths of wire by hand, his fingers shaking harder the longer he worked. Behind them, Eli stood planted like a pillar, head angled toward the darkness where Sadie's breathing came and went. At one point, the concrete above them groaned, and Hannah instinctively moved between Eli and the culvert mouth, afraid panic might send him charging forward. But he did not lunge. He did not break. He only listened, every muscle in his body drawn tight around the fragile sounds of metal, water, and the weak scrape of Sadie trying to hold on. It was as if he understood that one wrong movement could cost her everything. When the wire finally snapped loose, Sadie collapsed sideways with a thin, exhausted cry that seemed too small to carry the weight of all those missing days. Grace slid in at once, wrapped the injured leg, and checked for deeper damage while Owen and Ben cleared the rest of the debris. Eli answered with a low rolling rumble so soft It almost sounded like relief passing through stone. Hannah wiped her face and did not realize she was crying until then. They brought Sadie back on a padded crate strapped into the utility cart, and Eli followed the sound of its wheels all the way to the medical enclosure. He stayed outside the fence long after Grace carried the Serval inside. His ears still turned toward the place where her breathing now rose under warm blankets and clean light. No one at Red Mesa said much that afternoon. They did not need to. The blind calf who had once needed saving had led them straight to her. Sadie survived the first night because she was stubborn, and because Red Mesa had learned long ago that some lives only accepted help on their own terms. Grace treated the crushed leg, flushed the cuts, and kept the enclosure dim and quiet. No one touched the Serval more than necessary. Outside, Eli waited near the fence for hours, listening to every small sound from within. He did not return to the dead stillness of those first days after the crash. That was the first sign that something lasting had changed. He drank when Hannah brought the bottle. He found water without being guided. He even crossed the sensory yard alone, slowly and carefully, as if proving to himself that the map Sadie had given him still existed, even while she healed behind closed walls. For nearly 3 weeks, the ranch moved around 2 recoveries at once. Sadie regained strength in silence, pacing a little farther each day, her limp growing lighter as the swelling eased. Eli continued his training under Owen's watch, learning the slope of the ground, the sound of trough chains in the wind, the hollow note of the feed bins, the rough bark posts that marked safe turns in the yard. Hannah noticed the difference most at dawn. Eli still listened for Sadie, but not with the same helpless ache. He listened like someone honoring a voice that had changed him. Some mornings, when the air was still enough, Sadie would answer from her enclosure with a low, rasping chirr. Eli would stop, lift his head, and stand perfectly quiet, not panicked, not broken, only deeply, unmistakably glad that she was still in the world. By late summer, Grace declared Sadie strong enough to be released back to the outer grassland. May approved it without argument. No one at Red Mesa wanted to keep a wild heart behind wire longer than survival required. The gate to the release paddock opened at sunrise. Sadie hesitated only once, turned one narrow golden face toward the buildings behind her, then slipped into the high grass without looking back again. Eli felt her absence after that, but not as a wound. It was more like the feeling of a door left open in another room. He continued to grow, his body filling out, his steps becoming surer, the old shakiness fading from his legs. He was blind, and always would be, but blindness no longer seemed like the center of him. It was simply one fact among many, no longer the whole story. Autumn passed into the cooler edge of winter, and Red Mesa began discussing the next impossible thing. Grace believed Eli was ready to leave the recovery section for the larger protected grassland at the south end of the ranch, a broad, semi-wild enclosure bordered by low rock, mesquite, and dry creek channels. It was the closest thing to freedom they could offer without abandoning him to danger he could not yet judge alone. May reviewed the plan twice. Owen walked the route himself. Ben reinforced the outer markers with wood and tin where sound would carry best. Hannah said little during those meetings, though everyone could see what it cost her. She had sat beside Eli when he was all but gone. Now she was being asked to open the gate and trust that the world beyond it would not take him from them too soon. The morning of the transfer came bright and windless. The desert seemed to hold itself still for him. Eli stood at the threshold of the large south gate, with Owen near one shoulder and Hannah on the other side, close enough to help if fear took over. Beyond the open gate, Dry grass moved in long, pale bands, and the land stretched wider than any space he had entered since the crash that took his mother from him. 4.
A long moment, he did not move. He lifted his trunk and tasted the air. The breeze carried dust, sage, warm stone, and the distant wet trace of a hidden trough. Beneath his feet, the ground felt different from the packed safety of the yard he knew. It opened instead of enclosing. It invited instead of answering. Hannah felt her throat tighten. She knew that kind of hesitation. It was not weakness. It was the cost of stepping into a life no one could promise. Then, from somewhere ahead and slightly left, there came a soft metallic tap. Not loud, not dramatic, just a light, familiar knock against something hollow, followed by the faint scrape of paws. Eli's ears rose at once. His whole body changed before any human voice could. Across the open grassland, on a red stone outcrop beside an old boundary sign, Sadie stood outlined in the morning sun, slender and still, her healed leg bearing weight without faltering. She did not run to him. She did not call again right away. She only watched, then turned and stepped down from the rock into the tall yellow grass. A second later came another small sound. The same patient marker she had given him on the roof, along the fence, beside the water, at the edge of fear. Eli drew in a breath so deep it seemed to steady every part of him from the inside out. He crossed the gate slowly at first, one careful step, then another. The ground changed beneath him, but he did not stop. His trunk brushed the grass, his ears tracked the space ahead, and somewhere just beyond sight, the little guide moved forward with unhurried confidence. Behind him, no one at Red Mesa spoke. Owen lowered his head. Hannah wiped her eyes. May stood with both hands at her sides, saying nothing at all. By the time Eli and Sadie reached the rise beyond the first sweep of grass, they had become two moving shapes against the widening desert light. One large, one small, one blind, one watchful, both carrying scars the world had failed to finish into endings. The calf, who had once given up, now followed not out of helplessness, but out of trust. And in the hush of that open land, it was clear to everyone who watched, he was no longer stepping into darkness. He was stepping into life. If this story touched your heart, leave a simple comment below. Just type 1 if you believe love can heal, or type 0 if this story left you speechless. I read your comments, and they truly mean a lot. And if you enjoy emotional animal stories like this one, please subscribe to the channel and stay with us for the next journey. There are many more powerful, unforgettable stories still waiting for you right here.